Hello, this is Richard E. Brown. This is part 2 of this series on the atoning work of Christ. It addresses one of the earliest theories of the atonement, referred to as ransom to Satan. Interestingly, ransom to Satan was the dominant theory for about 900 years. It then fell out of favor for over 1,000 years, but recently has made a comeback starting in the mid-20th century. If you enjoyed this video, please check out my theology blog and resource site. As mentioned, this is part 2 of this series on the atonement. Part 1 introduced the subject and discussed the distinction between the fact of the atonement and theories of the atonement. This video will discuss a theory of the atonement referred to as ransom to Satan. Recall that the fact of the atonement is that the birth, life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ somehow allows mankind's broken relationship with God to be reconciled. Ransom to Satan is a theory that tries to explain how this actually happens. Here is a list of the major theories of the atonement, listed roughly in chronological order as to when they were first developed. The earliest two theories are called ransom to Satan, the topic of this video, and recapitulation. Both of these theories understand Christ's atoning work as defeating Satan or the forces of evil in some sense. That is, the resurrected Christ emerges victorious over Satan and his evil forces. For this reason, these two theories are referred to by the Latin term Christus Victor, which simply means victorious Christ. The copper engraving print shown here is in the spirit of Christus Victor, showing Christ with his cross standing triumphantly over the defeated Satan. Its caption is in Latin, but translated reads, quote, "It soothes the burning anger of the divine deity. After various cases of destroying, you will rise from death." Let's start with a preview of the ransom to Satan theory of the atonement. This theory assumes that prior to Christ's death and resurrection, Satan somehow had legitimate legal authority over all humans. In other words, humans could be considered legitimate prisoners or captives of Satan. This somehow resulted from the fall of mankind in the garden and is supported by scriptural passages referring to Satan as the god of this world, such as in 2 Corinthians 4:4, and Satan himself claiming authority over the entire world, such as in Luke 4, verses 5 through 6. In order to free humanity from Satan's kingship and authority, the Son of God is offered by God as a ransom payment, and this offer is accepted by Satan. In human form, Jesus Christ appears to Satan as something that can be eternally imprisoned in hell. But after Christ's death and the descent into Satan's realm, Satan soon realizes that he has bitten off more than he can chew. The divine power and glory of Christ is too much for Satan to hold. Christ defeats Satan's attempt at restraint and imprisonment, is freed from captivity, and is then resurrected. Christ's resurrection is therefore evidence of Christ's victory over Satan. Shown here emerging from the tomb is, according to the ransom to Satan theory, Christus Victor, the victorious Christ. Having presented a preview, let's now explore the historical beginnings of ransom to Satan. Try to understand why this was the first well-formulated theory of the atonement, and try to understand why this theory dominated Christian thought for about 900 years. In the mid-2nd century, there were several factors that led Christians to a strong dualistic mindset with an emphasis on the epic battle of good versus evil, such as is depicted in the book of Revelation. The first was Roman rule and the resulting sporadic times of official and unofficial persecution of Christians. The Roman Empire was the embodiment of evil that had assumed control of the material world, and Christians were the embodiment of God, who, seemingly against all odds, had to resist this evil in God's name. Second was the rising popularity of Gnosticism and Gnostic sects, where reality is divided into a good spiritual world and an evil material world. Somewhat related was the rise of Marcionism and the Marcion Church, where the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are different gods and in tension with one another. The Old Testament God is a jealous God concerned with exacting punishment and justice, whereas the New Testament God is a loving God concerned with forgiveness and redemption. There is a specific form of Christian Gnosticism called Valentinianism. In it, the spiritual and therefore wholly good Logos descends into the man Jesus. The Logos departed during the examination of Pontius Pilate, and therefore the divine Logos never suffered and died on the cross. In Marcionism, Jesus was a purely spiritual creature and only seemed to be human, and therefore only seemed to suffer and die on the cross. Both Valentinianism and Marcionism, which were quite popular, therefore had a strong emphasis on the battle of good versus evil. For those interested in more detailed treatment of these heresies, I have videos on both Gnosticism and Marcionism with links below. One of the early fighters against heretical doctrines and movements was Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus was an early church father who played an important role in both the spread of Christian churches and in the establishment of Orthodox doctrine. He was a student of Polycarp, who was in turn a student of John the Apostle. Irenaeus therefore had very close ties to apostolic teachings and apostolic tradition. Irenaeus's most famous work is called Against Heresies, which focuses primarily on describing and then refuting, as you might have guessed, both the Valentinianism form of Gnosticism and Marcionism. In refuting these heresies, Irenaeus presents a sort of proto-version of the ransom to Satan theory of the atonement. In the excerpt shown here, apostasy refers to Satan. Irenaeus writes, "And since apostasy held unjust sway over us, Christ justly turned against that same apostasy, redeeming from it his own, not by force, after the manner in which the devil had held sway over us at the first, greedily seizing what was not his own, but by persuasion, even as it befitted God to take what he wished by persuading, and not by imposing force, so that there should neither be an infringement of justice." Here, Irenaeus first introduces the idea that we are in bondage to Satan. However, whereas full ransom to Satan theories hold that Satan's bondage over us is legitimate, Irenaeus is clear here that he understands this bondage to be illegitimate, with Satan having, quote, greedily seized what was not his own, end quote. Second, Irenaeus introduces the idea of Christ defeating Satan through persuasion and not through force or otherwise by violent means. There is no mention of paying a ransom here, but the offering of a ransom can certainly be seen as a form of non-violent persuasion and is therefore compatible with fully developed ransom to Satan theories. This brings us to Origen of Alexandria. Origen is known as the originator of the ransom to Satan theory of the atonement, no pun intended. Origen was a scholar and theologian in the early days of the church who wrote thousands of treatises covering textual criticism, homiletics, hermeneutics, and many other theological areas. Origen founded the Christian school of Caesarea, where he taught logic, cosmology, natural history, and theology, and became regarded by the churches of Palestine and Arabia as the ultimate authority on all matters of theology. He was tortured for his faith during the Decian persecution in 250 and died 3 to 4 years later from his injuries. One of Origen's masterpieces is his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. It consists of 25 books, but only books 10 through 17 exist today in the original Greek. Luckily, Origen's Ransom to Satan theory is in book 16, and so we have it in Origen's original Greek writing. His Ransom to Satan theory appears here. Origen addresses it here because it is here that he addresses Matthew 20:28, which reads, quote, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." End quote. We now turn to Origen's commentary on this verse. Origen writes, quote, "Jesus gave his soul as a ransom for many who believed in him." To whom did he give his soul as a ransom for many? It is not fitting to say God, is it? Perhaps then to the evil one, for he was ruling in us until the soul to Jesus was given to him as a ransom for us. He was deceived, of course, and supposed that he could have power over him, and did not see that he could not maintain tortures in holding him. For this reason also, death, thinking it had power over him, did not have power, because he alone was free among all the dead and stronger than every power of death. And so much stronger that he set free from death all who wished to follow him, who were held by death, death having no power at all in them afterwards. For no one who follows Jesus can be seized by death. And when his soul had been given as a ransom for many, it did not remain with him to whom it had been given. For this reason, the prophet says, "You will not leave my soul in the underworld." End quote. Here, Origen understands the ransom referred to in Matthew 20:28 as a literal ransom that must be paid to someone. Scripture does not specifically say to who the ransom is paid, but Origen identifies the evil one as the only reasonable choice. This is the first component of the ransom to Satan theory, that the Son of God was paid as a ransom to Satan. Unlike Irenaeus, Origen understands Satan's authority over mankind to be legitimate. In Origen's view, mankind was originally under God's authority, but the fall effectively transferred this authority to Satan. This is why the New Testament describes Satan as the king of this world. Next, Origen explains that Satan was deceived in this transaction. Satan assumed that he could maintain power over Christ, but found out that he could not, quote, "maintain tortures in holding him," end quote. This is the second component of the ransom to Satan theory. A third component is also appears in this reading. This is that Christ, having died, proved to be stronger than death, and therefore, in a sense, defeated death, both for himself, resulting in his resurrection, and for all who wish to follow him. In the words of Origen, quote, "For no one who follows Jesus can be seized by death," end quote. It should be noted that in his commentary on Romans, Origen specifically states that the devil has legitimate authority over us due to our sin, and that the devil himself specified that the price for our release was the blood of Christ. That is, the specific ransom to be paid was specified by Satan and agreed to by God. Here are the main verses on which the ransom to Satan theory relies. We already discussed Matthew 20:28, and almost the exact same verbiage appears in Mark 10:45, which reads, quote, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." End quote. The only other place that ransom appears in the New Testament is in 1 Timothy 2, verses 5 through 6, which is also very similar in saying that Christ gave himself as a ransom. Another verse that seems to support the idea of Christ as a ransom is 1 Corinthians 2:20, which says that Christians have been bought for a price. Paul repeats this in a similar way in chapter 7, verse 23. In these New Testament verses, ransom is a translation of the Greek word lutron. Lutron literally means something to loosen with, in the sense of doing something that will set something loose or free. In its usage in these verses, lutron refers to the price to redeem something, which is simply what it means to be a ransom. Fast forward about 100 years, we now introduce Gregory of Nyssa, who was an important theologian and the bishop of Nyssa for over 20 years until his death in about 394. In terms of theological contributions, Gregory is typically grouped with his elder brother Basil of Caesarea and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus. Together, they are collectively known as the Cappadocian Fathers. Interestingly, the major contemporary critic of ransom to Satan was actually Gregory of Nazianzus. In fact, he was the last serious critic for a 900-year period until the emergence of Anselm and his satisfaction theory of the atonement. Gregory's philosophical and theological writings were strongly influenced by Origen. This includes the ransom to Satan theory of the atonement. However, Gregory takes the idea of Satan being deceived to a new level. In his theological treatise, Great Catechism, Gregory writes, quote, "In order to secure that the ransom in our behalf might be easily accepted by him who required it, the deity was hidden under the veil of our nature, that so, as with ravenous fish, the hook of deity might be gulped down along with the bait of flesh." With Origen, it seems that Satan deceived himself in thinking that he could have power over the Son of God in the flesh. With Gregory, God intentionally dupes Satan by concealing Christ's power under the veil of humanity, tricking Satan as a fish is tricked by bait on a hook. This position of God intentionally deceiving Satan is typically justified by 1 Corinthians 2:8, which reads, quote, "The wisdom which none of the rulers of this age has understood, for if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." End quote. In the context of ransom to Satan, the rulers of this age refer to Satan and his minions. They did not understand what they were doing in having Christ crucified and must therefore have been deceived by God. St. Augustine gave additional credibility to the idea of God duping Satan. In his Sermon 231, Augustine writes, quote, "And what did our Redeemer do to him who held us captive? For our price he tendered his cross as a mousetrap. There he placed his blood as bait." End quote. With the backing of St. Augustine, the ransom to Satan theory of the atonement remained unchallenged for about 900 years. As mentioned, it was eventually replaced by Anselm's satisfaction theory in about 1095. The ransom to Satan theory was then essentially relegated to the history books for about the next 1,000 years. This all changed with the publication of the book Christus Victor by the Swedish bishop and Lutheran theologian Gustav Ahlén. He believes that there were three main categories of atonement theories: classic, which includes ransom to Satan and recapitulation; objective, which includes satisfaction theory and penal substitution; and subjective, such as the moral influence theory. In his book, Ahlén argues that since all of the early church theologians held to the classic theory, such as Irenaeus, Gregory of Nyssa, and St. Augustine, this theory is the preferred theory. Ahlén's book was first published in Swedish in 1930. The original Swedish title was The Christian Idea of Atonement. The English translation was published a year later with the title Christus Victor, an historical study of the three main types of the idea of atonement. Ahlén argues that the early church fathers did not view the atonement as a formal ransom payment in the sense of a legal transaction. Rather, ransom was being used closer to its root meaning of loosening. The atonement is therefore the loosening of humanity from the bondage of sin, death, and the devil. This loosening of humanity from these things is Christ's victory. Therefore, Ahlén refers to this theory of the atonement as Christus Victor, rather than ransom to Satan or bargain theory. Ahlén's publication of Christus Victor was immediately influential and continues to be so today. A good summary of the resurgence of Christus Victor can be found in Ben Hugh's book, Atonement Theories: A Way Through the Maze. Pugh writes, quote, "In 1953, Dillistone persuasively added his advocacy of a Christus Victor approach as the one most in line with the general tenor of salvation history in both Old and New Testaments. John Macquarrie also lent his weight. Volume 2 of Paul Tillich's Systematic Theology, appearing in 1957, broke new ground in reappropriating Christus Victor categories in the service of his existentialist vision of the Christian faith. Oscar Coleman also gave some support. The Christus Victor view was also found to speak to liberation theology better than other models of the atonement. Darby Kathleen Ray, taking her cue from Paul Fides, adapted and demythologized the ransom to Satan for the feminist argument. She was followed by J. Denny Weaver, who during the 1990s began to recognize the nonviolent appeal of the model. He applies a similar reappropriation to Black and womanist contexts, culminating in his The Nonviolent Atonement. Eugene Tissell, in his short but significant work, also retrieved the model in the interests of social and political justice. More recently still, the emerging church movement favors a transition from penal substitution to Christus Victor as the preferred model. Other evangelical responses have also continued to flow steadily." End quote. This ends part 2 of this series on the atonement. There are 3 main takeaways. First, understand the basics of the ransom to Satan theory of the atonement. This is that humankind, after the fall, were under the legitimate authority of Satan. Therefore, God could not justify the use of force to regain this authority. Rather, Satan set his price, the blood of Christ, and God accepted. However, Satan incorrectly believed that he had the power to keep Christ in bondage after the crucifixion, but Satan was not powerful enough. Christ defeated death and was resurrected, emerging from the tomb victorious over Satan and the forces of evil. Second, be aware of the early development of Ransom to Satan. A proto-version appears in Irenaeus's Against Heresies, but this does not specifically mention a ransom and understands Satan's authority over mankind to be illegitimate. Origen then produced the first fully formed version of Ransom to Satan. This includes the idea that Satan deceived himself in thinking that he could contain the crucified Christ in hell. This idea of deception changes with Gregory of Nyssa, who describes God as intentionally deceiving Satan, likening this to a fish being deceived by bait on a fishhook, with Christ wrapped in a human body corresponding to the bait. St. Augustine describes the atonement in a similar way, using the metaphor of a mousetrap, with Christ being the bait. Last, be aware of the recent resurgence of the ransom to Satan theory after falling out of favor for about 1,000 years. This is largely due to the publication of Gustav Ahlen's book, Christus Victor, which argues that since all of the early church fathers held to what he calls classic theories of the atonement, such as ransom to Satan, they are to be preferred. With this restored academic respectability, along with its non-violent nature, Christus Victor has become the preferred theory of the atonement for a variety of Christian movements, especially liberation theologies. Thank you, and God bless.